Having now seen what occurred outside St. Paul's, we shall proceed to the vaults beneath it. Chalice and Judith, it has been mentioned, were described by Leonard, just before the outbreak of the fire, stealing into St. Faith's, and carrying a heavy chest between them. This chest contains some of the altar plate, which they had pillaged from the convocation house. As they traversed the aisles of St. Faith's, which were now filled with books and paper, they could distinctly hear the raging of the fire without, and Judith, who was far less intimidated than her companion, observed, "Let it roar on. It cannot injure us." "I am not so sure of that," replied Chalice, doubtfully. "I wish we had taken our hoards elsewhere." "There is no use in wishing that now," rejoined Judith. "And it would have been wholly impossible to get them out of the city. But have no fear. The fire, I tell you, cannot reach us. It could as soon burn into the solid earth as into this place." "It comforts me to hear you say so," replied Chalice. "And when I think of those mighty stone floors above us, I feel we are quite safe. No, it can never make its way through them." Thus discoursing, they reached the charnel at the further end of the church, where Chalice struck a light, and producing a flask of strong waters, took a copious draught himself and handed the flask to Judith, who imitated his example. Their courage being thus stimulated, they opened the chest, and Chalice was so enraptured with its glittering contents that he commenced capering round the vault. Recalled to quietude by a stern reproof from Judith, he opened a secret door in the wall, and pushed the chest into a narrow passage beyond it. Fearful of being discovered in their retreat, they took a basket of provisions and liquor with them, and then closed the door. For some time, they proceeded along the passage, pushing the chest before them, until they came to a descent of a few steps, which brought them to a large vault, half filled with bags of gold, chests of plate, caskets, and other plunder. At the further end of this vault was a strong wooden door. Pushing the chest into the middle of the chamber, Chalice seated himself upon it, and opening the basket of provisions, took out the bottle of spirits, and again had recourse to it. "How comfortable and secure we feel in this quiet place," he said, "while all above us is burning. I declare I feel quite merry, ha! Ha!" And he forced a harsh and discordant laugh. "Give me the bottle," rejoined Judith, sternly, "and don't grin like a death's head. I don't like to see the frightful face you make." "It's the first time you ever thought my face frightful," replied Chalice, "and I begin to think you are afraid." "Afraid," echoed Judith, forcing a derisive laugh in her turn. "Afraid of what?" "Nay, I don't know," replied Chalice, "only I feel a little uncomfortable. What if we should not be able to breathe here? The very idea gives me a tightness across the chest." "Silence," cried Judith, with a fierceness that effectually ensured obedience to her command. Chalice again had recourse to the bottle, and deriving a false courage from it, as before, commenced skipping about the chamber in his usual fantastical manner. Judith did not attempt to check him, but remained with her chin resting upon her hand gazing at him. "Do you remember the dance of death, Judith?" he cried, executing some of the wildest flourishes he had then performed, "and how I surprised the Earl of Rochester and his crew?" "I do," replied Judith, sternly, "and I hope we may not soon have to perform that dance together in reality." "It was a merry night," rejoined Chalice, who did not hear what she said, "a right merry night, and so tonight shall be, in spite of what is occurring overhead. Ha! Ha!" And he took another long pull at the flask. "I breathe freely now." And he continued his wild flourishes until he was completely exhausted. He then sat down by Judith, and would have twined his bony arms round her neck, but she roughly repulsed him. With a growl of displeasure, he then proceeded to open and examine the various bags, chests, and caskets piled upon the floor, and the sight of their contents so excited Judith, that shaking off her misgivings, she joined him, and they continued opening case after case, glutting their greedy eyes, until Chalice became aware that the vault was filled with smoke. As soon as he perceived this, he started to his feet in terror. "We are lost, we shall be suffocated," he cried. Judith likewise arose, and her look showed that she shared in his apprehensions. "We must not stay here," cried Charles, "and yet," he added, with an agonized look at the rich store before him, "the treasure. The treasure! "Aye, let us, at least, take something with us," rejoined Judith, snatching up 2 or 3 of the most valuable caskets. While Charles gazed at the heap before him, hesitating what to select, the smoke grew so dense around them that Judith seized his arm and dragged him away. I come," he cried, snatching up a bag of gold. They then threaded the narrow passage, Judith leading the way and bearing the light. The smoke grew thicker and thicker as they advanced, but regardless of this, they hurried to the secret door leading to the charnel. Judith touched the spring, but as she did so, a sheet of flame burst in and drove her back. Charles dashed past her, and with great presence of mind shut the door, excluding the flame. They then hastily retraced their steps, feeling that not a moment was to be lost if they would escape. The air in the vault, thickened by the smoke, had become so hot that they could scarcely breathe, added to which, to increase their terror, they heard the most awful cracking of the walls overhead, as if the whole fabric were breaking asunder to its foundation. "The cathedral is tumbling upon us. We shall be buried alive," exclaimed Charles, as he listened with indescribable terror to the noise overhead. "I owe my death to you, wretch," cried Judith, fiercely. "You persuaded me to come hither." "I," cried Charles. "It is a lie. You were the person who proposed it. But for you I should have left our hoards here, and come for them after the fire was over." "It is you who lie," returned Judith, with increased fury. "That was my proposal." "Hold your tongue, you she-devil," cried Charles. "It is you who have brought me into this strait, and if you do not cease taunting me, I will silence you forever." "Coward and fool," cried Judith, "I will at least have the satisfaction of seeing you die before me." And as she spoke, she rushed towards him, and a desperate struggle commenced. And thus while the walls were cracking overhead, threatening them with instant destruction, the 2 wretches continued their strife, uttering the most horrible blasphemies and execrations. Judith, being the stronger of the 2, had the advantage, and she had seized her opponent by the throat with the intention of strangling him, when a most terrific crash was heard causing her to loose her gripe. The air instantly became as hot as the breath of a furnace, and both started to their feet. "What has happened?" gasped Charles. "I know not," replied Judith, "and I dare not look down the passage." "Then I will," replied Charles, and he advanced a few paces up it, and then hastily returned, shrieking, "It is filled with boiling lead, and the stream is flowing towards us." Scarcely able to credit the extent of the danger, Judith gazed down the passage, and there beheld a glowing silvery stream trickling slowly onwards. She saw too well that if they could not effect their retreat instantly, their fate was sealed. "The door of the vault," she cried, pointing towards it. "Where is the key? Where is the key?" "I have not got it," replied Charles, distractedly. "I cannot tell where to find it." "Then we are lost," cried Judith, with a terrible execration. "Not so," replied Charles, snatching up a pickaxe. "If I cannot unlock the door, I can break it open." With this, he commenced furiously striking against it, while Judith, who was completely horror-stricken, and filled with the conviction that her last moments were at hand, fell on her knees beside him, and gazing down the passage, along which she could see the stream of molten lead, now nearly a foot in depth, gradually advancing, and hissing as it came, shrieked to Charles to increase his exertions. He needed no incitement to do so, but nerved by fear, continued to deal blow after blow against the door, until at last he effected a small breach just above the lock. But this only showed him how vain were his hopes, for a stream of fire and smoke poured through the aperture. Notwithstanding this, he continued his exertions, Judith shrieking all the time, until the lock at last yielded. He then threw open the door, but finding the whole passage involved in flame, was obliged to close it. Judith had now risen, and their looks at each other at this fearful moment were terrible in the extreme. Retreating to either side of the cell, they glared at each other like wild beasts. Suddenly, Judith, casting her eyes to the entrance of the vault, uttered a yell of terror that caused her companion to look in that direction, and he perceived that the stream of molten lead had gained it, and was descending the steps. He made a rush towards the door at the same time with Judith, and another struggle ensued, in which he succeeded in dashing her upon the floor. He again opened the door, but was again driven backwards by the terrific flame, and perceived that the fiery current had reached Judith, who was writhing and shrieking in its embrace. Before Charles could again stir, it was upon him. With a yell of anguish, he fell forward, and was instantly stifled in the glowing torrent, which in a short time flooded the whole chamber, burying the two partners in iniquity, and the whole of their ill-gotten gains, in its burning waves.